Hey writers, you're listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast, where we bring you insights and inspiration for growing your self-publishing business. We're your hosts. I'm Laura, one of Kobo Writing Life's author engagement managers.
And I'm Rachel, Kobo Writing Life's other author engagement manager.
On today's episode, we spoke to author Erica Ridley. Erica is a New York Times bestselling author of witty, feel-good historical romance novels, including the critically acclaimed Wild Winchester series. Her debut young adult horror novel, The Protégé, releases this summer. When not reading or writing, Erica can be found eating couscous in Morocco, ziplining through rainforests in Costa Rica, or getting hopelessly lost in the middle of Budapest.
We had such a fun and fantastic conversation with Erica where we did touch on her world travels, but we also talked a lot about her writing career and how she's moved through both the indie and trad publishing spaces and now works as a full-time hybrid author. Erica talked about her translations. Her books have been translated into, I believe, 9 languages. So she told us what that process is like, both from an indie and a trad perspective. And she also talked a lot about how she brought her background as a professional marketer into her indie author career. She shared some incredible advice on her marketing strategy, her newsletter, how she promotes her long-running series. There's so much great information in this episode for both new and seasoned indie authors alike. I hope you got a lot out of it. I know we did, and I hope you enjoy. We are joined today by best-selling author Erica Ridley. Erica, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Can you kind of start us off by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself and the books that you write?
I am a full-time author. I live in Costa Rica. I've written about 60 some odd books at this point, so quite a few, primarily historical romance, though I have some other romance novels, and I have a YA horror thriller coming out in a couple months.
And did you always know that you wanted to be an author, or how did your writing career come about?
I did always know I wanted to be an author. I can't actually remember a time when I didn't love to read and write, but my family was the opposite of encouraging where that came from. They felt, a career that would pay me was going to be a smarter choice. And they didn't really think that author was something I could pull off. So I did the normal, go to college, get a day job in an office building thing at first, but I never lost that love. And I finally decided to try. I gave myself just like little goals. Can I even write a manuscript? That's step one. I had met all these people who were going to write a book someday. And I was like, am I one of those, or am I a person who can actually do it? And then I just got on the train, kept going, and eventually made a career out of it.
Well, as somebody who has definitely said the words, I'm going to write a book someday, it is impressive that you have over 60 under your belt.
Yeah, over time.
Like you mentioned, you did the office job, you had the full-time gig, and you actually had that full-time gig when you started your author journey. And I'm curious, first, how did you balance being a published author with having a full-time job? And when did you make the leap into full-time authorship?
So my first main full-time job, like as a professional, was at an advertising agency, which was actually really good to give me a marketing background. My degree is also in marketing. And then I started my own company, which was like software and website development and things like that. But that was actually also a great foundation for being an entrepreneur when it came to self-publishing later on down the road. So I was already used to juggling my own hours and, just working when and how and where I could. And so I fit in writing whenever I could. But after I sold my first book, I realized that if I ever wanted to make a true career out of it, I couldn't also be putting in 60 hours a week in my own company. I needed to make a choice. And that was actually when I moved to Costa Rica, because I decided, a lower cost of living would give me a little bit more flexibility. And it was the greatest thing I ever did. I know that's not replicable for most people. I don't know everybody's life, but for me, that was a choice that I made, no regrets. And it let me really scale down what I was doing with my day job in order to focus more on my author career.
And when did you hit the point where you were like, okay, now I can do this full time and I don't have to worry about my day job anymore?
So it took a long time. I'll be super honest. It overlapped for many years. My first 3 books were through traditional publishers, and it paid almost nothing, just a pittance. So there was never any hope of it even being more than a side gig from that until self-publishing came about. And I was wide from the beginning, to use the parlance, if your your listeners will know what that means. And I started, self-publishing my own books. My first attempts were not super successful because I didn't really know what I was doing. But once I created a series instead of just random one-off books, so my first series that I self-published was The Dukes of War, and that did really well pretty much right away. And by the end of that series, it was a 7-book series. By the end, I had hit USA Today and New York Times and realized, oh no, this is a thing I can do. And I got rid of all the last of my clients. And I was like, no, this full speed ahead.
And like you said, you started in trad, you went indie, and now you're a hybrid author. And so I'm curious if you can kind of tell us a little bit about your publishing journey and how you went from, trad indie and then back a little bit into the trad world.
Yeah. So at the time when I started trad, that was really the only choice. The internet existed and things like that. I mean, people, like Elora's Cave was selling PDFs, but it wasn't really, you didn't hear about people making good money, like living wages as self-published authors at that time. And there was a lot of taboo against it. Like you were a failure if you self-published your own book, you couldn't hack it. And I bought into some of that at the time. But like I mentioned, my first 3 books, they were published traditionally. They got decent reviews and everything like that, but it just didn't pay. And during the course of those 3 years, when those books were coming out, indie really was taking off. And I had friends, like close friends, that were making far more money than I was. And, maybe their books weren't in, Borders, which still existed at the time, but they were earning a living wage, which was not something I could boast. And so I was like, maybe I should try this. And when my option proposal didn't get picked up, which means my publisher didn't buy my next book, and so I decided to self-publish it instead. And that was not the book that was a runaway success, but it was instrumental in teaching me the ropes and how to do it, what am I doing, and figuring out what the steps were to do it myself. And then, as I mentioned, my first series, once I did that, and I thought about it from a marketing standpoint. Like once I realized the mechanics of how self-publishing worked, I took a step back and I said, okay, if I want a success, what does that look like? And I started with the product. I was like, well, what kind of title sells best? And I was just very nerdy about the whole thing. Investigated everything that I could, came up with a plan and implemented it. And then that went great for a while. Well, I mean, I had never stopped self-publishing. And then several years ago, I guess now, an editor from Forever at Grand Central reached out through my agent to see if I would be interested in writing historical romance for them, which I wasn't thinking trad anymore. I had already completely jumped ship from that. But I thought, well, it can't hurt to reach the most readers possible, right? Like if I want to be wide, if I want to hit, as many bookshelves as I can, it didn't make sense not to diversify. And I'm glad that I did. I wrote the Wild Winchester series. That's 6 books. The final one is coming out in a couple months. It was a lot of fun. And it did definitely hit a different audience than my self-published books do. So I don't think that those 2 paths like in any way conflict. I don't think one is right or wrong. It's just kind of like whatever you want to do. I will say that one reason that I'm definitely doing trad for my YA is I do feel that in that specific market, traditional publishing reaches more children, educators, schools, things like that than I can personally do on my own. But when it comes to genre fiction, adult genre fiction, indie is very viable, and it just is a matter of how involved you want to be.
Did you have a moment when you were going back to trad where you were like, oh, I'm not used to kind of handing over the reins for some of this like I used to be?
So maybe the question is, have I ever stopped having that moment? It is very hard. Once I figured out the indie thing, it became very difficult to understand certain decisions that were or were not being made, or timelines that baffled me, things like that. I am lucky enough that I do feel that I was consulted on a lot of decisions. I was not necessarily, listened to per se, but consulted at least on various things. And so I was not disappointed that way, but it is very different. I mean, you don't get to pick in the way that you do with indie. You know, what's your cover going to look like? What's your title going to be? Who's going to be your audiobook narrator? You know, things like that. You might get to voice an opinion, but the final decision is always going to come down to the publisher. And so that's definitely a trade-off.
Yeah, it's definitely different to not have the final say on everything like you would if it was one of your indie books, for sure. That kind of brings me to my next question that we love to ask hybrid authors. What do you think the trad publishing industry could learn from indies?
Oh, man. I actually think there's a lot that they could learn. And the first thing, if I were a consultant for a trad publishing company, I would tell them to take a good look at their data. I feel like they must have such a rich data set that indies don't have their hands on, but indies know their data so well. Like we know, oh, I'm selling this much on this platform, and when I put it at this price point, this is what happened. And when I changed the cover, this is what happened. And I feel like with trad, they're not taking advantage of that resource, which I think would be the number one best thing they could do to really leverage sales and marketing in a little bit more impactful way.
And conversely, since you have kind of re-entered the trad sphere, have you learned anything from that experience that you've now brought to your indie publishing life?
I think maybe I'm considering more things like, for example, in trad publishing, they're more concerned with PR types of marketing as opposed to, you know, like get a BookBub ad, which would be a more indie thing to do. And it's not something that I ever pursued as an indie author. Whereas in trad, you know, I will get asked, oh, do you want to write an essay for this magazine or whatever, which would not have crossed my mind. And now I'm considering it. I'm like, oh, well, if I ever, you know, branch into a different genre in indie, like that would be a way to establish a platform beyond like the book itself. I could maybe look into things like that I wouldn't maybe have considered if it weren't for being exposed to it through trad.
Yeah, that's so true that there is a lot more PR in the trad world than there is in indie. You mentioned up at the top that most of your books do exist in the historical romance genre, and I'm very curious what drew you to historical romance.
I would say, it was the gateway to romance for me as a reader. So the very first romance novel I ever picked up was a Joanna Lindsey, and basically I never looked back. I auto-bought every historical romance I could get my hands on. And so when it came time to write, I did not start with that. I started with suspense, which was my first love as a reader. And that didn't sell. And then I switched to historical romance. And then that was what initially sold. And, you know, kind of once you get on a path, or at least in my case, once I was on that path, it was harder to get off of it because you're trying to develop an audience, a platform, you know, all those kinds of things. And as much as I personally love to genre hop as a reader and as a writer, I understood the importance of building a base so that readers would know what to expect from you as an author. And so that is why the vast majority of my backlist is in that's one genre.
But, and correct me if I'm wrong, within the genre of historical romance, you do kind of play around with subgenres. I know you lean a little bit into like a little bit more comedy, a little suspense. You have gothic romance. Do you find that kind of allows you to fill the desire to genre hop a little bit?
Absolutely. That's so true. Yeah, you're absolutely right. From the gothic to the paranormal to suspense. And, you know, I've got, you know, the Wild Bunches is a heist-based series, you know, so a little bit of everything, action, adventure within that umbrella. So yeah, I definitely think there are ways to play if you like to spread your genre wings a little bit without getting too far out of the box.
And do you have a lot that goes into kind of like the research side of your writing to make sure everything is historically accurate, or what does that look like for you?
Yeah, so that is actually one reason why almost all of my historical romances have been in the same time period, because I very much went into a rabbit hole where I wanted to have a strong base knowledge about the time period and place before I started writing in it. And then you get a feel for it. But I had made all these like lists and macros and things, and I have my subscription to the Oxford English Dictionary so I can see if this word was in use at that time period and if it was used in the same way we use it today, which is another thing that changes, and, you know, all that kind of stuff. I do make an attempt to be as reasonably historically accurate as I can without detracting from the story. That's kind of like my line in the sand. I'm not going to talk about hygiene and, you know, like some some very real realities that would make my stories far less romantic. But I'm ahistorical when it suits the story. But and no apologies for that. But I do try my best within reason to keep everything as historically accurate as I can. I have books on, the clothing and what the housing layouts was like and the carriages and all that kind of thing. But it is very easy to get lost in the weeds with research. So I also try to cut myself off. And when I'm drafting, I try to only look up something if it's plot relevant, if I can't move on. And otherwise, I just leave a little note to myself to come back and like look at this element later during the editing process. That way I don't get in my own way.
What is one of the most obscure research rabbit holes you have found yourself in?
Oh man. There's probably so many, but I'm blanking now thinking, can we come back to it?
Absolutely. I just love a Wikipedia hole and I find myself in them all the time. So I was just very curious if you had one that like stood out to you as like, oh man, this one time I was researching like this kind of button and next thing you knew, I was like 18 steps down.
Well, I will say, like, when I was writing The Protege, for example, it is a thriller set in the fashion world in Paris in the 1880s. And at that time, I don't know if you know, but there was a specific Parisian green dye that was made with arsenic. And so there was that was just a delightful rabbit hole to go down, just how deep that went and how people actually at the time in the writing of my novel in the characters world the regular people didn't know that it had arsenic in it, but in real life people figured it out that it was killing them and didn't stop because they liked the color too much. Like Queen Victoria actually had a guest room painted arsenic green, and guests would complain when they spent the night there that they would wake up in the morning sick. But it was beautiful. So
If looks could kill, am I right?
yeah.
Sorry. I'm also curious about your writing process, though. We've touched a little bit on research, but I'm curious how your writing process looks and how it's kind of evolved throughout your career.
Yeah. So I, like probably many writers, I'm going to guess, started out completely not planning anything, just seat of the pants kind of writing. But I quickly discovered that in my specific case, it was much less work if I would plot the book up front and then write it, and then any structural problems would have been dealt with before the book existed, rather than wait until I had 400 pages written and then try and fix it, which is much harder for me. I am one of the writers who loves the actual writing. I have friends who prefer editing. That is not me. So yeah, I'm very much a plotter, and my plotting style changes with every book. I am constantly iterating and figuring out which things were helpful, which things were not helpful. Some things that I was taught as an aspiring author, like you have to make these character interviews, what's their favorite ice cream color? None of that was useful to me. I mean, I did it all. I will try anything to see if it helps, but I also don't want to waste my time. So like for me personally, that kind of stuff is not helpful. But I do like to get into my characters' heads from a more psychological standpoint. I like to know how they would react and why, and where they're coming from, and then how that will inform like the conflicts that they have with other characters and things like that. So I do spend probably 2 to 3 days figuring out my characters, and then another 2 to 3 days figuring out the plot. And it's usually asynchronous, so not in chronological order or anything. Like I'm just thinking, oh, it would be cool if this happened, and oh, that would be a great twist if that happened. And then later I put it all together and see what fits, what I have to throw away, what I have to add. And then once I have it all in order, I use an app called Scrivener, which I love, to write. And then usually by the time I finish writing my first draft, it is pretty much solid. There's always edits that have to take place, like revision, but it's usually on the page level and not in a structural level. So that is great for me. That is how I prefer to work.
Now, we talk to a lot of authors on the podcast, and one common theme that we tend to see with plotters is that the plot structure is there, it's, pre-planned, and then the characters in the book have another idea of how the story is going to go. Is that something that also happens to you, or are you pretty good with sticking within your preset structure?
So I would say at this point, usually the structure is what it is. That usually doesn't change too much. Like whatever turning points I have plotted, it tends to be what really happens. But within that, it is very much like jazz. You've got your chords there, but the melody changes. It's not what you thought it was going to be. So yeah, I get surprised every day when I sit down. I know the scene is the scene where they're gonna infiltrate the castle or whatever, but I don't know what that looks like until I sit down and do it. And sometimes things will come up organically that'll change what happens later. Like, oh, well, now I know that this conversation that comes later has to, refer back to this moment. Or there can be like a joke callback, or maybe like a future love scene will have to change because of something that was said or done here. And I love those kinds of moments.
And looking at the plotting from like a big picture, like you mentioned, when you started out, like series is the product, like writing in a series. Do you ever plot out at that big a level, looking from like book one through to the end of the series, or do you take it book by book?
So I usually, at least in broad strokes, do. So like to use the Wild Winchester series, for example, those are 6 siblings. So I planned it as a 6-book series to start with. And they're kind of an Ocean's 11 style heisting family, doing Robin Hood things. So I had to figure out, what each sibling's like talent was, which would then be kind of the focus of their book. When their book came along, that would be the direction that their specific adventures took place. And so like, to that degree, I definitely did plot it out in advance, but I didn't specifically know who each love interest was going to be, or like who the villain was going to be, or anything like that. But I did want to have an overarching point, a theme to the series, so that readers would know what to expect from all the romances within it.
I also wanted to chat with you about your translations a little bit. I think you have books in 9 different languages now.
That could be true. Yeah. It sounds about, I mean, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but yeah, that sounds right.
I think so. What is the process like for you for your translations?
So a chunk of those were done via either Trad or my literary agent, who also sells subrights for me. But some of them I reserve to do indie myself. I do my own French, Italian, and German translations. So the ones that are sold are just sold. So that's if you have an agent or if you can sell them yourself. Sometimes publishers will reach out and say that they are interested in purchasing the rights. But from an indie perspective, the first thing I do is I get recommendations from other authors for their translators, and then I go directly to their book pages and see what the reviews are like, because just because the translator is a very nice person doesn't mean that we're going to click. And then usually what I do is I'll ask them to translate the first 3 to 5 pages, something like that, and then I will find some native speakers and have them read that and see if they think it sounds compelling, because there's just such an art to it. It's not just translating the words. You have to make it sound like a real book, right? And so at that point, then you, as the author, become more of a project manager. Then I make a relationship with these translators. Like, for example, the same person has translated all my Italian books. I've had 2 main German translators, but just 1 Italian one, for example. He's translated my entire backlist. And so we work really well together. And he has an editor as well, so it goes through him. He does his translation, and it gets professionally edited by another different native Italian speaker, this whole thing. And then we'll work together too for creating material for my website or social media or Italian language newsletter, things like that, so that I can communicate with the readers in a way that sounds legible to them, like make it sound like a book they would want to read. And it has actually been fantastic. I would say, particularly in my genre, in my experience, translations have been even better than audiobooks as a way of reaching new readers.
And for authors who are just starting the translation process, do you have any advice for not only finding a translator, but for breaking into a market that they may not be familiar with?
Honestly, I did not do much breaking in. I just released the books in multiple formats. Okay, so my biggest piece of advice would be, if you can time it so the audiobook comes out as close as possible to your ebook, that is the way that you want to go, because each one's popularity will feed off of the other one. It will float both formats up to the top. When you release an audiobook much later than the original format, now you have to make it a marketing event and try and get it in readers' faces. And it is not impossible, but it is trickier than if you can time it at the same time. But if it just comes out in multiple formats, then your regular product pages will often do a lot of that legwork for you.
And kind of sticking with marketing, like you brought a marketing background into your indie author career. And I know that you have a newsletter, you have a street team. What strategies and how do these strategies feed into your overall marketing strategy?
Yeah. So when I decided to create my first series, I specifically sat down and I was like, what do readers want? And I went and I looked at all the retailers, found their top 100 lists, looked for what the tropes were and the genre that I wanted to write, all this kind of stuff. And so I was like, okay, well, that's great. I can write a book that contains these elements, but how do I communicate that to the reader? Because when I worked at the ad agency, there was a commercial division that made ads, commercials for toys for children. And they said you had, 8 seconds to generate 3 reactions, which is what? Wow, I want it. And basically, I tried to do the same thing. Like, how do I do that on my book page? And so the first thing is a title. If you can get your trope right there in the title, like my first book to hit a list was The Duke's Accidental Wife. It was number 9 on the New York Times. And I think the title was a big part of that because you saw right there, you knew exactly the genre, what the conflict was going to be, all this kind of situation. You had your setup. And then, of course, your marketing copy is your description. It's not a book report, right? You have to think of it as you're selling this. The reader's going to make a decision, not even reading the whole thing. They're going to make a decision based on like the first 2 or 3 sentences, whatever, the top is that they can see. And then, of course, the cover, same thing. It's not about what you think is the prettiest cover, the most, whatever. Your preferences actually have very little to do with it. And you're probably wrong about whatever you think is going to reach the reader. And if you can do A/B testing, that will really level up the reaction that you get from your real target audience once your book is out there in the wild. And with a note on A/B testing, what I mean by that is not polling your existing readers, because that is not a true market test. Like they might go with whatever the rest of your books have looked like or whatever, because they already know and like you. So that's not the opinions actually that you're looking for. Also, what readers say they'll do and what they'll actually do are 2 different things. So the best way to do it would be to have like 2 different ads or 2 different posts that are identical, except for changing either your title or your cover or whatever it is that you're testing. And then whichever one is the clickiest is your answer. And so you can kind of find out that way. And so basically I looked at everything in that kind of way, to figure out, what is the tagline that resonates more? What is, just all the different pieces that would help sell the book. Because being fully honest, when my book hit the list, it wasn't because it was a good book. Nobody had read it yet. It just came out that week, right? So it wasn't even about the content. It was about the packaging. And that is a thing that you can and should control that a lot of indie authors maybe, or a lot of, well, if you're a trad author, you can't control. That's the publisher. But as an indie author, that is something you fully can manipulate to try and get your books in the hands of the right readers.
As someone with that marketing background, do you feel pressure to change your covers when there's like a new trend coming out, or do you kind of just like leave them as is?
I do change my covers occasionally. I feel that they're getting stale, but I don't necessarily jump on the new trends. So like, for example, right now, I do have one series that has illustrated covers, which is very trendy right now, but I didn't recover my entire backlist in that style. I didn't feel that it was necessary. If I were to see from data, like from A/B testing or whatever, that it would make a substantial difference in reach, then I would absolutely consider it. But I wouldn't chase a trend just for trend chasing. I think there is a danger, and trad falls into the same bias as much as indie does, where we see that book XYZ has success, and so we copy the things we see about it, when that might not be the reason why it's successful. It might have succeeded in spite of its cover or in spite of its title, not because of it. And so it is very dangerous to just follow a trend blindly.
That's a really good point. Yeah, you definitely see trad following the cover trends pretty frequently. And for your translations, do you switch up the covers there?
Yep, sometimes I do. Yeah. I also am not married to the English language title. If there's a different title sequence that will make more sense for that target audience, I will absolutely do whatever makes the most sense for those readers. And the same with the covers as well. So some markets, in my English language markets for historical romance, for the longest time, clinch covers, so a passionate embrace, what best sold a book. However, in other cultures, that is looked down upon. And so you would be much better off with, girl in beautiful dress or something like that. So you can't impose your culture onto another culture when you're translating.
That's a great point. And yeah, it's something that does well, like in North America, wouldn't necessarily draw in the same audience in Europe, for example. So it's always good to kind of switch it up. You've been publishing indie for a while now, and the landscape has, I would say, probably changed pretty drastically since you started publishing. How have you evolved your marketing strategy to kind of keep up with the changes?
So I would say I primarily doubled down on my newsletter and other ways where I connect directly to readers because, well, one thing that we say, like in marketing, not specifically related to books, but with anything, is that it's much easier to keep a customer than to find a new one, right? It's cheaper, it's easier. They're already there. Just don't let them get away. So keeping that in mind, like it's much easier to cater to your existing fans who will then become your street team. Your whole newsletter is suddenly your street team, and they're doing word of mouth, and you can build that way much easier than perhaps trying to jump on every trend, every new social media platform. Is fully impossible. It would be a full-time job to try and be TikTok viral and Instagram viral and everything else all the time. I mean, unless that's a thing that you love to do, in which case go for it. But if you prefer to be writing, then I think you really need to kind of pick your platforms and pick a place to excel, and that will be fine. It is better to excel in one thing than to just kind of meh 100 different ways. And ads are also very important. I would say they have changed a lot over the course of my publishing, like what is available. Things have come and gone. I really love Kobo's platform. I check for the new promos every single month there. Highly recommend. And things like, BookBub that have come up, and then there's been others that have gone away. And, Facebook ads is different every 2 years. They completely revamp how that works and what you can reach and things like that. So a lot of it you do kind of have to keep up with. But again, I would say don't try to do all the things. It is better to be consistent and good at one or two things than to just be lost at all of them.
Yeah, one common trend that we always hear is the importance of newsletters and reaching your readers. And I'm curious, what can listeners who subscribe to your newsletter expect? And do you have any advice for authors who are just starting out theirs?
So people who subscribe to my newsletter get slice of life as well as information about my books. I will tell them if I'm, traveling, what's going on, because I want them to get to know me. So if you're an author, your fans are on your newsletter because they want to know about you. They already know what's in your book. They read your book. That's why they're on your newsletter. So don't feel that you only have to talk about my book, my book, my book, my book all the time, especially if you have very few books. You don't want to be a broken record with that. But also don't be afraid, particularly to share your quirkiness. Like if you wrote this book because you're a huge space opera nerd, talk about it. Like what are your shows that you watch? What is the thing that drives you? Because chances are really good that these people love those things too. And if they feel that they connect with you on that level, it is a parasocial relationship there, then they are more likely to pick you as an autobi author, to follow perhaps other directions that you go. Maybe they wouldn't have jumped to this other genre that you decided to write, but they will because they know you and they want to give you a try. I would say consistency is very important. I know from experience that a lot of authors are terrified to email their email lists, and you should not be. They're on there specifically because they want to hear from you. So don't be afraid to talk to them. They really want that, or they wouldn't be on your list. And likewise, don't be afraid when people unsubscribe. That's also totally fine and valid. We've all had overflowing inboxes. Don't take it personally. It doesn't mean usually that you send out something like super offensive or anything like that. It's the self-cleaning oven of newsletter marketing. So you will get new people and you will lose some people. It's totally okay. But I would say email more frequently than you think you should, and your readers will be very happy.
I think that is excellent advice. And along with newsletters being a constant, indie author community is another constant that we hear about when we talk to other authors. And I know you've had like collaborative relationships with authors before. And I'm kind of curious from your perspective as someone who has been in the publishing industry for a while, how important is the indie author community and these collaborative relationships?
Oh, I wouldn't be where I am today without all the other indie authors in the community. Absolutely. I cannot overstate it. It's just so much. When I go to a conference, for example, I learn so much more from the other people that are there. and the water cooler conversations that we have than even the workshops usually. It's the connections that you make. The person who's looking for another person to round out their anthology thinks of you and they'll call you up, or nobody calls anybody, they'll text you or they'll email you. And also for just information for somebody to say, oh, well, I tried this and this is what happened. And then you'll be like, what? I never even knew you could do that. And you make these really great friends. I have friends that I've been great writer friends with since we were all aspiring authors before we'd ever published anything. And we share everything. We share numbers with each other. This is how much money I made on this book. This is how much money I spent on my translations and that kind of thing, which is invaluable. It's not something you'll find out by Googling usually. So you need to have those connections to even know what you're talking about or what you're looking for. And it's also great to have people that have your back, that want you to succeed. And there's just such a really helpful communal group of writers out there. We're just a small town in a way. If you can find your tribe, like it's fantastic when it comes to that. I also have kind of like with friend groups, like maybe you have a friend group that you do certain hobbies with, but not other things. It's the same kind of thing. So I have writer friends that we get together to do co-working together or writing retreats or to talk marketing or to talk craft. And they're not necessarily the same people, although there may be overlap. If you're starting out, if you can find maybe, I would suggest 2 specific groups, a group that's at your level that you can maybe exchange manuscripts with and do some critique partnering, things like that, but also someone that's a little bit aspirational. So you can have a little bit more of a mentorship going on. You don't want to, be a responsibility to that person, but you definitely want to surround yourself with people whose careers is something that you would strive to achieve. You want to always be reaching up to their level and, not down.
I think that's some great advice there. And there's so many really nice indie authors that Rachel and I have had the opportunity to meet at conferences. And one of the things that we always love is how welcoming everyone is to newcomers and people just getting started in the industry. So yeah, I definitely think it's important to kind of find your tribe there for sure.
Yeah, I was going to say roughly the same thing, that like one thing that's always blown me away ever since I started in this role is just how non-gatekeepy the indie author community is. Like, I mean, there's always an exception to every rule, but for the most part, everybody is so open, whether it is with like just numbers and raw data or like, yeah, like I tried this and it didn't work, but maybe it'll work for you. Like everybody is so helpful. And I just think it's magical.
It really is. I love it. There's so many resources. And if you're an author that's somewhere where you don't have in-person writers, don't worry. The internet is your friend. There are Facebook groups and Blue Sky groups and everything else that you can find with people that will love to help you.
Yes, so many good online resources now for sure. Threads is blowing up. Blue Sky is blowing up, like you mentioned. So lots of opportunity to find people online. One of the things that I wanted to touch on was your traveling, because when you're not writing, you're also exploring the world. How do you balance the desire to travel with like your deadlines and your writing?
So a couple of different ways. The first and most exciting thing I've done recently is I took a sabbatical. So I took a whole year off of writing new words. It wasn't a year off from being a writer. I don't have that full luxury. So I did have edits and promo and things like that. But I was able to spend time just traveling and enjoying that. But the advantage of being a full-time writer is that I can do it from anywhere. So one thing I like to do when I'm traveling is instead of having just this tight, packed schedule that you might, if you're only traveling you only get 1 week out of the year of vacation or whatever the case is, then of course you're going to want to go, probably, to take advantage of being wherever you are. But in my case, if I can be at an Airbnb for a couple of weeks or whatever, then I can treat it like I'm at home. I can go out and explore on the weekends and still work 9 to 5 on my books, Monday through Friday, or just whatever days it is. It doesn't have to be those specific days. And so then I'm able to kind of blend the two in a way where I don't feel like I have to constantly be writing or constantly have to be out in the street doing touristy things, and take it more of a slow travel sort of way. And I've always loved traveling more like a local in that kind of sense. I like being in an Airbnb instead of a hotel. I like eating in the mom and pop hole in the wall places instead of the chains, that kind of thing. And getting to know the people that are around in the area and striking up conversations with them. and you never know what's going to lead to something else.
Which kind of leads to my question. What kind of inspiration have you been able to draw for your writing from traveling, whether it's location or somebody you've met?
Yeah, so I don't actually have data on how weird I am in this, but I don't usually base characters on other people. I know people who do, but I would love to do an informal poll and find out how common that is. But as for like places, I love to do just the randomest stuff when you go places. The first time I went to Lisbon in Portugal, for example, they had a carriage museum. So perfect for me. I don't know who else is going to the carriage museum, but I nerded out and had the best time. And when you go to these kinds of things, or I was in Slovenia and they had an exposition on desks from just, it sounds random. I know. Stay awake, stay with me. But like desks over just centuries, like what were they like? And that started some plot rabbit holes because there's some very, very intricate ones with their secret drawers and they're this and they're that, or that were multi-use in a way that I did not know existed in that time period. And so then later, I never know in advance what random detail will find its way into my story, not necessarily just as a detail, but maybe even a plot point later. And it's just from going out and exploring. And not just museums, but also, like local food, local music. I love going to festivals and then finding, what is the traditional thing that you eat for this holiday, or what is this dance that you're doing, this song? And sometimes that kind of thing will then make its way into a book too. And I love the serendipitous nature of it, where it's not necessarily something I'm looking for, but I'm just experiencing the world, and then I can bring that to the world of my characters and they can bring it to the readers.
I love this. And I'm also a little bit upset because I was in Lisbon last year and I didn't know there was a carriage museum, but now I have a reason to go back. So thank you for that.
I hope it's still there. I went to the carriage museum many years ago now.
So one of the things I wanted to ask you about was your young adult debut. What inspired the shift in genre for you? And can you tell us a little bit about what readers can expect from the book?
Sure. So actually, when I was very small, my first love was horror, and I always wanted to be a horror writer. I wanted to be the next Stephen King. That did not happen yet. We'll see. Time will tell. Sorry, Stephen, if you're listening. You'll always be the first one. And so actually, my editor, Bria, had reached out to me to see if I would have interest in writing this genre for her. And I had not thought about it in years, but yes, absolutely. Baby Erica is just freaking out, squealing over this possibility. And so it has been an absolute delight. I actually just turned in this week my second young adult thriller horror. And in this particular one, in The Protege, it is about a working class French girl who would kill to become assistant to Paris's top modiste, and does. She goes out on a rampage of revenge against the people who killed her family, and it is all sorts of kind of John Wickian fun set in a historical setting. And I had just an absolute blast writing it.
That sounds like so much fun. And I'm so curious if there was ever a challenge going from the like adult romance space into YA specifically.
Well, I will say that I don't completely understand the do's and don'ts yet. So I've only had the one book edited so far, and it was very amusing to me, the moments that I thought were going to get stricken from the manuscript that were allowed to stand, and the others where she was like, no, delete this. We can't do this. This is for children. Okay. So I'm still learning. But yeah, I just kind of let my editor be my guide when it comes to that. Like I said, I just turned in a book a couple days ago that hasn't been edited yet. And I know there's going to be surprises that are going to come back to me in the comments both ways. Things that I thought were fine that maybe aren't, and things that I thought were problematic that are just fine. So.
And do you have any aspirations now to go into like adult horror and thrillers in the indie space?
I would love to. That is actually something that I'm going to work on this year. I am in the idea brainstorming phase now, which I have just a massive file full of ideas, but I'm looking to see like what is going to be the main idea that's going to carry me through. And I hope that by the end of the year, I will have written my first adult thriller. Yes.
Well, we'll be on the lookout for that, and we'll be cheering for you to knock Stephen King off his pedestal.
No, I said next, not only. Not the only.
So, along with your YA books, you also have, like we've talked about, a really long backlist. And I'm curious how you keep readers interested in longer series and also bring in new readers into your backlist at the same time. How do you kind of balance that?
So sometimes that goes back to strategy. So my longest series is the 12 Dukes of Christmas. There are, surprise, 12 books in this series. And I set that up as a series of 3 quartets on purpose so that there would be an entry point. So in the middle of the series, so there's 3 kind of chunks, right? That you could, I mean, obviously it would be best if you read the whole series, you would get to learn everything about this eternal Christmas town that I have created. But just knowing that 12 books can be daunting for a new reader, being able to send them, like maybe book 1 for whatever reason isn't their favorite trope. And I would hate for them to not give the series a try altogether. But if they know they could actually start with series 5, and then that would set up a different arc, or they could start with book 8, and that would set up a different arc, then they give other entry points into the series. So I think there are ways to create ongoing continuity for existing readers. So after I wrote Dukes of War, I wrote Rogues to Riches, which was a spin-off series. So if you had read the original series, then the first book of the other series, you recognize the hero as being the brother of one of the previous heroines and like that. But if you hadn't read the other series, you're not lost at all. You don't have to know the backstory of all those kinds of things. So it makes it also a good entry point for someone new, as well as being fan service for someone who has been around before. And so I think there are things like that that you can play with so that your books can reach both sides.
And when it comes to promoting those early series of yours, do you have an active strategy to bringing new readers now into your backlist for finished series, I should say?
Yeah, so I do a couple different things. One thing I like to do is create multiple boxed sets. So I would have like a whole series box set, but I would also have like the first 4 books or the first even 2. I'll have a duet box set, like things like that, because you can promote those differently. You can run price promotions. I love to do those primarily on the first book in the series, which I will often leave perma-free or perma 99 cents, depending on what my strategy is at the time. But I will also do price pulsing on other books in the series as well, join different promotions like how Kobo will have a 50% off or 40% off usually for, readers, things like that to get people into the series. I definitely will nominate all of my titles, not for the same promotion, but over time, I don't only focus on the first book in the series. If you have a series that must absolutely be read in order, then I would probably focus only on the first book in the series. But if they're just connected, if it's all set in the same world or it's a bunch of siblings or whatever, and it's actually okay for someone to come in at book 4, then I wouldn't limit yourself to just the first book. But I would say you do need to always kind of keep your books in readers' minds. It doesn't have to be price promotions all the time, although I do think that's one of the most effective things that you can do. But you can, if you're on social media, you can highlight a different book every week, or depending on your backlist, every month, every week, every day, whatever you've got going on there. But also don't forget your newsletter. I have books that have been perma-free ever since their inception over a decade ago. And every time I mention it and that it's free, it gets a ton of clicks. So you can't assume that someone who's following you knows everything you know about your backlist. Like, you feel like you've talked about this book a million times and there's nothing left to say, but there's always someone new who's hearing about it from you right now for the very first time.
I think that is excellent advice. Thank you for that. And I'm really sorry to go from such excellent advice to such a silly question, but I would be very remiss if I didn't ask this. And I think Laura's going to be a little bit mad at me about it. But your website has a bad joke section. And famously, I love a bad joke. And
Very
so
infamously, actually.
No, famously. You leave the infamous alone. So I have to ask, what inspired this section on your website? And not to put you on the spot, but do you have a favorite bad joke?
I do not have a favorite bad joke, but I love me a bad joke. So I'm with you on that. You will often find me cackling over the most ridiculous memes or, BuzzFeed or Cracked article. So yeah, it's very much part of my personality as a person. And so it became part of the website kind of for the same reasons I was saying about the newsletter. Don't just learn the titles of my books that are available. Learn a little something about me. What what can you expect from me as an author? If you see that page and you read those jokes, you get a sense of my humor, and then maybe you'll know what's in store for you. And if we match in that kind of way.
Well, you had me cackling earlier. I will tell you that. Laura is my witness because I read through the whole page.
Can confirm.
Just thank you for bringing a little bit of light to this Tuesday.
You're very welcome.
We've talked about your upcoming release, your YA debut. Do you have any other irons in the fire that you can tease us about?
This August, I have Waltz on the Wild Side will be coming out. It's the final Wild Winchester's book. So it's full of heisty fun and goodness, enemies to lovers. So the Wild Winchesters is my caper committing family of siblings, and for the first time, the love interest wants nothing to do with it. And so we have some butting of heads, which is a favorite trope of mine, and lots of fun dialogue and shenanigans.
Excellent. We will definitely include a link to probably the pre-order page based on when this comes out to that book. And as we wrap up here, where can listeners find you online?
I am Erica Ridley everywhere on all the socials, ericridley.com, anywhere.
Awesome. And again, we will include links in our show notes. And Erica, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This has been great fun.
Thanks, Erica. Thank you for listening to the Kobo Writing Life podcast. If you're interested in picking up Erica's books, we will include links in our show notes. If you're enjoying this podcast, please be sure to rate, review, and subscribe. And if you're looking for more tips on growing your self-publishing business, you can find us at kobowritinglife.com. Be sure to follow us on social media. We are at Kobo Writing Life on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Threads.
This episode was hosted by Rachel Wharton and Laura Granger, with production by Terrence Abrahams. Editing is provided by Kelly Robotham. Our theme music is composed by Tearjerker, and a huge thanks to Erica Ridley for being our guest. If you're ready to start your publishing journey, sign up today at kobo.com/writinglife. Until next time, happy writing.